All right, guys, welcome back to the Diesel Queen podcast. We are back again with some Hitachi stuff. Now, this can be applied to pretty much anyone that runs heavy equipment, but we're specifically going to be covering in Hitachi today. If you are just listening to this podcast, I would recommend saving this and watching it later. There's going to be a lot of visuals in this podcast because I'm actually going to be walking around a 350 Hitachi excavator, pointing out the daily checks and some of just basic locations of filters and fluids and things like that. So if you are just listening to this, you're going to be missing out on some stuff because a lot of this is visual. I can explain where these things are all I want, but it's so much better to actually show you guys because I don't know if any of you guys are like me, but I learn from seeing and I learn from doing. That is how I learned them. And I actually feel like most mechanics are like that. So I'm going to cover some things and go over some talking points. And then I'm going to also show you live in action on a real machine where everything is. To start out this whole machine walk around, it's really important to do a walk around every day. Just to do basic shit, right? Like check the fluid levels, which we're going to be going over. The easy fluid levels at least. And then, greasing. You should be greasing your machine every 8 hours. So guess what that means? If your shift is longer than 8 hours, means you grease it more than once a day. I hope y'all are listening. Grease your shit. Trademarked by the Diesel Queen. Grease your shit. You do not want your pins to turn into pin and bushing jobs that are extremely expensive. You need to be greasing your machine. It is so much better, as a mechanic, and I have learned this, it is so much better to just replace pins and bushings when they get loose. It's actually really easy. Because they're wear items, right? Bushings are wear items, and pins are wear items, so they will wear out eventually. Obviously, if you do grease them regularly, it is going to extend the life of those pins and bushings drastically, like extend them drastically. But even when you do have to get to the point where you're replacing pins and bushings, it is so much less time consuming for the mechanic, which means less downtime for you. If we can just replace pins and bushings that are loose, it comes apart really easy at that point and just replace it. It's so much easier and less time consuming to do it that way than it is to not grease your machine and have them all seize together, weld together, bushings are spinning. Now you need a line bore, like all this stuff. Trust me, that I don't know, 30 minutes you spend every 8 hours greasing your machine is going to be worth it in the long run. So is checking fluids, but greasing is really important. So to start our walk around, we're going to start with the basic maintenance of things. So the very first things, obviously, that you want to make sure you do is grease it. Grease it, grease it, grease it. And this does not mean just try to pump grease in it, and then if it doesn't take grease, it's whatever. If something doesn't take grease, guys, you need to have someone come and fix it because, again, no grease on components that move that are designed to be greased equals bad times. Make sure all your greasers are taking grease. When you do grease something, make sure you are removing the dirt from the greaser before you attach the grease gun. Just so you're not pumping dirt into something that is not designed to have dirt in it. That's important. And then fluid checks. So I'm going to go around and I'm going to try and talk through it a little bit here, and then I'm going to stitch in some actual physical walkarounds on a 350 excavator. All right, guys. Today I'm at an Hitachi dealership in Ohio, and we have a 350 here that they graciously are letting me use. And today I'm going to be going over the fluid checks, where all the fluid checks are, and actually how to check them. I can't remove anything or physically take any bolts out, but I can show you how to do it properly and go over the proper fluid checks on this machine. All right, so to do the fluid checks on this machine, we're just going to start from one side and go around and work our way around and then work our way up top. Some of these checks are going to have to be done outside, or we're going to have to move it to do the checks, but I will go over that when I get there. We're also going to go over the filter locations because those are super easy to see in this. So this is your fresh air cab filter. The recirculating air filter is behind the seat in the cab. This is your engine air filter, and it's important, this little valve, you can sit here and squeeze to get the dust out of it. It is important to check and make sure that these are not packed full. which this is new, so it's not going to be, it's going to be fine. But this has an exterior air filter and an internal air filter. So this is really important to make sure that these are seated properly. This machine's already been PDI'd, so somebody already did that. But it's really important to make sure these are seated properly, so if they're not, obviously, it only takes a cup of dirt to completely destroy your engine. Valve always goes down because that releases dust that builds up in these canisters around the outside of the air filter. For starters, on the left-hand side of the machine, and this is as you're sitting in the cab, left-hand side of the machine, check all your grease zerks, grease everything. And then when you get to the compartments on the side of the excavator, that's where your batteries are. You can make sure your terminals are clean, make sure there's no corrosion going on with your battery terminals. Your washer fluid is also over there. On the left side of the cab is your clean air filter for your cab. Behind the seat is your recirculation air filter for your excavator. And those locations can change depending on the machine. We're talking about a brand new 350 here, so your operator's manual should tell you where they are. And then when you go back in there, like I said, the washer fluid is back there. The engine air filter is also on the left side. It's really important. They have these little rubber boot things, and it's really important to like squeeze those and get some of the dust out of there. There is actually a service interval for those boots, just so they don't wear out, or they do wear out, and so you can replace them. You have two air filters. You have a primary and a secondary air filter. It's kind of the same concept of fuel filters. Basically, the outer air filter is more designed to catch like big shit, and the inner air filter is more further meant to increase the capacity of catching very, very fine particles. Do that. Make sure they're seated properly before you put the cover back on. And it's a good thing. You don't have to take the cover off every day, but you do have to check that little valve just to kind of release some of the dust that gets built up in that housing. And then we're going to swing around to the other side of the machine, the right side of the machine from the ground. We'll cover the final drives later. That's something that I'm going to cover kind of last in this. Final drives are not something you need to check every day unless if they're leaking. So we're going to go around to the other side, to the right side of the machine. There's not really any fluid checks over here besides the finals, which we'll get to that in a minute. But there are a bunch of filters over here. So this is the engine oil filter. This little yellow filter back here is your pilot oil filter. And these two are your fuel filters. This clear one is your water separator, which is your primary fuel filter, which the fuel is pulled through. And then this is your final fuel filter, which is a smaller micron rating, and that the fuel is then pushed through that filter. So you have your fuel filters, you have your pilot oil filter, you have your engine oil filter over there. Your engine oil filter is a remote mount. That's what it's called. It's called a remote mount when it's not actually on the engine. But it's really nice. It's easy to get to that way. And so those are some other really important things that you need to be checking every day. You're also underneath, between the body or the frame and the track or whatever you want to call it, is where your hydraulic drain is. It's also where your fuel sediment drain is, which is also important. All right, so underneath the machine, underneath those panels over there, is your hydraulic drain. Now there's usually two fittings on the hydraulic drain. One is pointing vertical and one is pointing down. Always remove the one that's pointing down from experience, because if you don't, you will get a face full of hydraulic oil from experience. This hole right here, there's a little Allen and a little tube in here, and that is your swing motor drain. And then the engine oil drain is underneath this panel. You can see the engine breather tube is right here. So the engine oil drain is right underneath this panel. You don't need to just be draining the water out of your fuel separator. There is actually a service interval for draining the actual sediment out of the actual fuel tank itself. There's a lot of fluids on this. Also, on the right side of the machine, in that compartment, there is a pump drive dipstick. It's a little teeny tiny yellow dipstick, and your pump drives have their own little oil in there. All right, so this is the pump chamber of this excavator, and back here is your pump drive, which is little tiny cute dipstick. And this is going to be really hard to see because this is brand new. It's right in between the low and the high, right there. So that's good. So make sure you're checking your pump drive. the little dipstick is pretty self-explanatory. Make sure you're draining the water out of your fuel water separator. Make sure you're changing those at their intervals. And then same with your oil filter and your pilot oil filter. Pilot oil filter is a little yellow one. That's different from the hydraulic filter. So then we are going to go up the staircase. And before we ascend into this machine, on the very first staircase, underneath the stair is actually your DEF tank. All right, so this is the next compartment we're going to cover. This has your DEF tank in it, and there is a little clear sight glass on the side of the tank that tells you how full your DEF is. Usually your machine will alert you if it's empty, but it's, new machines are actually not shipped with DEF fluid in them, or it's shipped with very, very little DEF fluid. Same with fuel. So it's a good thing to verify that. You do not want your machine to derate itself because you don't have any DEF fluid in it. Verify your DEF fluid, keep it clean, keep that area nice and clean. There are DEF filters in there. There's two DEF filters. There's a sending unit or a pump unit filter for the DEF system, and then there's also what's called a header unit filter sock thing, which is inside the tank. If you go and try to change those, you need to make sure that you keep that freaking clean. The DEF system is very finicky and very small tolerances with some of this stuff. So it's very important to keep that clean. I know we don't like, a lot of people don't like DEF, but that is just how the modern world is going to go. Everything has DEF nowadays, so it's really important to make sure that that system stays up and running, because that is vital to your engine running correctly. Because if you get codes with that or something is wrong with that system, it will derate your full machine, and it will not let you underate it until it's fixed. And usually that requires a dealership to do that. You cannot do that. You cannot clear DEF codes and after treatment codes unless you have, you're a dealer. So keep that clean, keep that good, keep it full, make sure your DEF fluid itself is clean. Make sure it's, you're cleaning the cap off before you fill it up. Stuff like that, just to minimize any type of problems. And then, ascending the stairs, we are going to be getting into the engine compartment. Now, before we go into the engine compartment, right dead center in the center of the machine is your swing motor. Now, this particular machine only has one swing motor. Some of the bigger Hitachis actually have two, but it's the same concept, it's just doubled, right? All right, so the next thing we're going to check up here is the swing motor. And the swing motor, like the pump drive, has a little dipstick in it. It's actually a little low, but there are two little marks here. So make sure it's in between those marks. This is gear oil. This is your engine compartment, and there are two fluids that we'll be checking in this. This is your coolant, which is obviously pretty self-explanatory. There is a low and full mark. Usually you should check this when it's cold, which this is right in between the lines, so that's fine. And then this is your engine oil dipstick right here. And I don't know if you can see that, but this little circle and this little circle are the range. So it's good to have it at this circle or slightly below the top circle. That is how they do their little safe zone on these. Swing motors have their own fluids for their gears, and it's gear oil. So that is a dipstick, obviously, and that is something else that you can check and make sure that that is within specification. And again, the drain for the swing motor drive is underneath the machine, in the middle, on the towards the center of the machine. And if you look up into this little access hole in the frame, you will see a little Allen plug, and that is your drain for your swing motor. The next thing in the engine compartment is your coolant, which is pretty self-explanatory. Check your coolant every day, make sure that's within specification. Then your engine oil check is also in there. Check your engine oil, make sure it doesn't smell weird, make sure your engine oil looks good, smells good, is at a good level. Again, it is so much cheaper to check all of this stuff ahead of time than it is to have a catastrophic failure. So this is important. Also, on the very top of the machine, if we go over to the top right-hand side of the machine, there are two big circular plates, is what they look like. All right, so this is where your hydraulic oil filter is. Your filter is this case right here, but this right here is a super freaking important thing on this, because it does not matter if you're just doing, this is your main hydraulic filter, the other one down there is your pilot filter, there's a difference. But if you're doing anything with the hydraulic system, including draining the tank, or changing this filter, you have to press this button because these tanks are pressurized, and if you do not unpressurize them, fluid will come out at a very fast rate. So there you go. The one with the little button on the top is how you relieve hydraulic pressure. Now, this is really, really, really important if you are doing any type of hydraulic repairs, or even if you're just changing the hydraulic oil and filter. Speaking from experience, if you do not relieve the pressure in that tank, or you forget, it comes out very fast from the drain. Speaking from experience, I learned that lesson the hard way. So the other panel up there, the big circular thing up there, is actually the main hydraulic filter. And that can get quite messy, but it is underneath there. So if you're doing anything with the hydraulic system, it's really important to relieve the pressure in the hydraulic system, and you can use that button on the top. And I like to sit there and push it a few times just to make sure, because it is pressurized. So, make sure everything's lowered to the ground, all that shit, and then relieve the pressure in the hydraulic tank. And then the very last thing we're going to cover, last things we're going to cover is the things that we have to check while it's running, or to run the machine to check them. So the very first thing we're going to cover is the hydraulic oil. Now, the hydraulic oil is one of the only fluids on this particular machine that requires certain steps to check it. You can't just check it, cold. You are required to run it for 5 minutes, and then you extend the arm all the way out. You curl the bucket all the way in, and you lower the boom all the way down. And then you shut it off. To check the hydraulic oil, it's a lot more in-depth than just checking sight glass. You have to have the arm extended all the way out, the bucket all the way curled, which this doesn't have a bucket on it, it's just a coupler, but it's going to be a similar height. And then lower everything to the ground before you check it. And then you check it, come over here. So this is the hydraulic tank sight glass, and you are supposed to idle this for 5 minutes to warm the oil up a little bit. This might be why it's a little bit low, but as you can see, the fluid level is right here. It's supposed to be in between these two ones. But that is a hydraulic oil level check. And that is how you check your hydraulic oil. The tank sight glass is on the right-hand side of the machine, behind one of them panels. It's super easy to see. So make sure you're checking that every day. The other things that you got to do to move the machine that we'll cover is the final drives. So I'm only going to show you one final drive because it's basically the same. As I kind of showed you, you do have to track this. It's a lot easier to do this with somebody to help you gauge this. But this level mark, it's really important that this is right side up, because if it is upside down, this is not actually centered at the final drive. It is actually above center line a little bit. So if it were to be on the other side, your oil level would technically be too low. So it's really important to put it up here with the up symbol up, down symbol down. Some of these don't have up and down or up and drain. Some of them just have a line with an arrow on it. So make sure that's right. And when you take these plugs out to check this oil, do not just take this plug out, or you will get sprayed in the face. This is pressurized, so you have to take the one above, take that one out first, and you'll hear the pressure release. And then you're good to take this level check out. These final drives, the check plug on these is not actually centered. So if you do not pay attention, these new machines are super easy because it literally is stupid proof. They have up printed on it, they have drain printed on it, and they have level printed on it. Some of the old machines don't have that. Some of the old machines are just a line with an arrow for the level. So it's really important because these are not centered. So if you do not have that level mark on the right side of the final and it's upside down, you're going to go to drain it and it's going to drain a lot of the fluid out, and you're not going to have the right level. It's going to be too low. So make sure it's at the level mark. To have someone watch while you track the machine and track it forward enough to everything's lined up. And then before you check it, before you pull that level plug out, make sure you pull the up plug out. Because, again, speaking from experience, I'm pretty sure every mechanic has done this. If you do not pull the up check, or the upper plug out, you will also get a face full of really stinky gear oil. Speaking from experience, which is usually black, by the way, because it's a gear bath. Those are pressurized inside those housings, so to relieve that pressure, you need to crack and remove the upper plug that is above the fluid line before you remove the fluid plug, or you will just get a face full of oil. Everybody knows, pretty common knowledge, to check things like your air filter or check things like your engine oil or grease every single day. But the other thing that is really important, especially if you are in an environment where you could be getting a lot of contaminants into your fuel tank or into your storage fuel tanks, or you're just in extreme environments, one thing that is commonly overlooked is this fuel water separator. This should be checked every day, and it should be pretty obvious if it starts to get water in this. Water is really bad for your fuel system. So to drain this, you literally just crack this. And as you can see, this doesn't have any water in it, but that's how you drain it out. And then make sure you get it tight again. That is really important to drain any little water or anything in the bottom of this bowl out every day. The next thing we're going to cover, I'm not going to go around and show everyone every single grease zerk on this machine. The main point and the concept of this is grease it every day, at least once a day. Really, you should be greasing it twice a day, but at least every 8 hours. So if your shift is longer than 8 hours, guess what? That means grease it more than once a day. A lot of these grease zerks, there's a grease zerk here at the back, but you're never going to reach that unless you fold it under. There's grease zerks at the bottom. There's grease zerks for the swing. Most of these, as you can see, the grease lines coming off of these all go down to like a little grease bank back of them. Those are pretty easy to get to, but if you cannot get grease into something, or grease is not coming out when you grease it, you need to address that immediately. Not just sit there and let it not get greased for the next 4,000 hours. There's lots of techniques that technicians have at the shops, at the dealerships, to unclog grease lines or unclog zerks, or sometimes you need a whole new zerk. But just make sure you do that, because that is going to be so much cheaper than having to replace a pin and bushings prematurely, because it wouldn't take grease for the last 2,000 hours, and no one addressed that. The very last thing that is I personally would check this at least once a week, is the track sag. Before you go to check this adjustment, it's really important to make sure that you clean the tracks off. There is a specification on how many times you do. Basically, just do it back and forth a few times, full speed, full rabbit, full power mode, and just knock all the dirt off before you check. Then when you check it, there is a picture in the manual. It's basically the center of the tracks, which is really easy to find, and it's just this middle section. So make sure this is clean dirt. And the specification is roughly 13 inches to 15 inches. There is a millimeter specification because this is Hitachi, but that's the rough first. So then you measure this, 13 3/4. So that's actually perfect. Tracks that are too tight can wear components a lot faster. Tracks that are too loose can either fall off, ignore them, it's great. So let's say this was too loose. If you wanted to tighten it, there's a grease zerk in here, and you put grease into it to tighten it. You loosen it and take grease out of it to loosen it. So if you wanted to tighten this up, pump more grease in there, and then run it a few more times, and then check it again. And you do that, repeat that step until it's at specification. This one is at specification. Track sag is super important to the life of your undercarriage. If it's too tight, it can prematurely wear things. If it's too loose, they can fall off, and that can also cause premature wear. So it's really important to check your track sag. And I will show you that. It is so much easier to show you how to check that than it is to actually explain it. But the concept is you swing your machine around to the side you need to check, and you pick up the machine off the ground, that one side off the ground, and just run it a bunch of times in both directions. High speed, rabbit, full RPM. Just run that thing over and over and over again. Run all the dirt off of it, and then check it in the middlemost of the frame of the excavator. Your owner's manual will give you a nice little picture. I've done these enough times that I know which roller it is. And then you measure. And Hitachi has them in millimeters, so I just converted them to inches, which is roughly 13 inches to 15 inches. This machine measured at 13.5, which is good, and we're going to send that. That's good. This machine was PDI'd, so obviously this is going to be right. For those of you that are unfamiliar with a PDI, it's pre-delivery inspection, and that is where the dealerships before it's even delivered to you, goes through and checks all the fluids, checks all of the track adjustments, checks a bunch of bolts, torque specifications, all kinds of things. So this was already done, but I just wanted to show you guys how to properly adjust these tracks. It is actually a grease, like a cylinder, that tightens and then loosens tracks. So if you want to tighten the tracks, you pump grease into it. If you want to loosen, you have to loosen the fitting and let the grease come out of it. It can be quite messy, but no matter what, do a little bit at a time, and every time you pump a little grease in there or little bit out, run it again, the track in a few circles, and then recheck. And I said that's really important for the life of your undercarriage, and like as a whole, is your track adjustment. For any tracked machine, actually, it's not just excavators, but since we're here with a 350, this is what we're going to be covering. That is the basics of the walk around for a 350 excavator. This is basically the same for almost every single excavator, mid-size at least. Obviously, like I said, once you get into bigger excavators, sometimes they have 2 swing motors. The little ones don't have a swing drive like oil level at all, like the little minis. Some of the zero turns have different placements for their filters. Like zero turns do have different placements for their fuel filters and their oil filters and stuff like that. So this is a good basic. I mean, you can take all of these concepts that I've told you and showed you and apply it to your machine. Because like I said, and I'm a big believer in maintenance, guys, because if you do not take the time to do the proper maintenance on your machine and do all these checks and make sure everything is good, if you don't take the time to do it, your machine will make time for you. And if your machine is making the time for you, I promise you, it is going to be more downtime and more expensive than it would have been if you would have just done it yourself consistently. Like I said, the 30 minutes a day to do this is worth it. Greasing, guys, is worth it. And if it doesn't take grease, have someone come out and fix that. And either put a new grease zerk on it or a new grease line. Make sure your grease zerks are actually taking grease and your pins are actually being greased. It does you no good to pump grease into something that is not actually taking the grease and it's just getting spit out the grease zerk because there's too much back pressure in there. It's not actually getting to the pin. Guys, if you're a foreman, even if you gotta buy your operators grease guns to get them to grease their stuff, like electric grease guns, do it. It's gonna be cheaper in the long run. I know I've said that like a million times, but like I said, if you don't make time for this, your machine will make time for you. And I promise it will be more expensive when your machine decides it's done with something and it's going to break down. Now you don't have a choice. It doesn't matter how busy you are. It doesn't matter what job you're in. It doesn't matter what your deadlines are. Your machine does not care. It will make the time for you. And this is any machine. So avoid all that. Avoid the downtime. Schedule your maintenance. Schedule your greasing. Schedule all this shit in so your machine runs to the best of its ability. All right, guys, thank you for coming to my podcast. I hope this was helpful and I hope this was informative. If there's anything else you would like me to cover, I have access to Hitachi machines. I have access to these things. If there's anything in particular you guys would like more information on, let me know in the comments and I will get with Hitachi and see if we can cover those things for you. Thank you for stopping into my podcast and I will see you guys next week.